special occasion for a keynote lecture by Nava Ashraf. That, as they always say, needs no introduction, but I do want to make an introduction because I have rare opportunities to say things of people that I admire so much as Nava. And they invited me to make the introduction. Welcome to this auditorium and welcome to this keynote lecture. I'm going to get this right, so I'm going to read on the things that are formal so that you have an idea of who our next keynote speaker is. Nava is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the founder and director of the Altruistic Capital Lab at the LSE Department of Economics, and she's also co-director of the Psychology and Economics program as STICERT. One of the things, among many things that you can find in the resume of Nava is an award that she won in 2012 called the Rising Star in Global Health by the Grand Challenges in Canada and the Gates Foundation. And the reason I bring this up is because since the time that I've known Nava, that I don't know how many years it's been, but I've known you for many years, I always see you rising, and you rise and rise and rise. And today you will hear an example of what it is, the reason she was called a rising star. The contributions of Nava to development economics, to behavioral economics, and to the economics of families is something that it's of a long trajectory that you can find everywhere in her resume, in her Google Scholar profile, and the like. But there are two pieces that are my favorites that have to do with two main issues that I think all of us here in this academic scientific community have to do. One of them is not forgetting the roots, and the roots is this beautiful paper that she wrote with George Lowenstein and Colin Kammerer on Adam Smith being the first behavioral economist. And it's a beautiful piece that you can see why it's always important to remember to go back to our roots intellectual and scientific. And that article to me has always been that beautiful place that when I have to tell someone about what is behavioral economics and what does it have to do with economics and with the actual economics, and people who are skeptical of behavioral and experimental economics, I say, read that because you will get to that. The other amazing article that is very well known and widely cited that you all know is Tidying Odysseus to the Mast, that you probably have read, you have seen, and it's a piece that she did along with two co-authors, including Dean Carlan, and it's this incredibly complete, well-designed experiment in the Philippines to get people to save. But the reason also I'm bringing this up is because probably you're familiar with new developments in the discussions, intellectual discussions about nudging, about the effects of RCTs and the like. We have all probably seen the paper by Linos and De La Viña in Econometrica, a recent paper showing that for most of the studies in nudges, the effects are very small, and most of the significant effects that are economically significant, even at tiny amounts, are in economic journals. But once people try to scale up in large-scale RCTs and the like, many of the effects disappear. That paper that Nava did in the Philippines, that experiment is an exception. It's an exception in the sense that because of that amazing project, what year was that deployed in the field? Early 2000s. And it got people to increase their savings in terms of economic terms by 86%. And that's rarely seen in terms of these experimental interventions, to see that this is more than just finding stars in the regressions. This is about the economic impact, the actual economic impact of doing in the field the things that we all research about. And that's probably an example of what I admire most about this person here that we have as the keynote. And it's a person that when I say she's always rising, is because she's always changing the methods, the approaches, updating, learning, creating, listening to develop amazing experiments, amazing studies that she's going to tell us today, but always thinking about the grand questions, thinking about the grand problems that have to do with families, with communities, with development, and the like. And this is why I said I'm going to take this opportunity to say this about Nava, because it's someone that I admire and someone who has always so many things to share with us, and it's an honor to have you here. So please welcome Nava Ashraf.
Hi, everyone. I hope you all get the experience of having someone who I've admired for my whole life, who helped me on all the first experiments as a PhD student. To say something like that embarrasses the heck out of you. So thank you very much, Juan Camilo. And actually, just to say that that paper of the Tying Odysseus to the mast, that was during graduate school, and I was studying development, and I knew that our models of human nature were really incomplete, and that if we had a more complete understanding of human nature, we may actually be able to be more impactful in the field. But so I wanted to bring together behavioral economics and development economics, and the response I got was, well, isn't that third order for development? And I said, well, let's find out, and I think the incredible thing about the experimental methodology is that we can just look at the data together and really just investigate these kinds of questions. And this paper is in that same vein of trying to tackle things that are of a broader understanding of human nature and quantify them, comes a little bit towards understanding what might be driving them, and see what they might imply for the way, in particular here, that we design work and jobs. So this is with some wonderful co-authors. Oriana Bandiera is also a professor at LSE. She and I direct the Altruistic Capital Lab together, which is a lab where we, in collaboration with large-scale organizations, run experiments looking at these broader drivers of motivation. And Virginia Meany, who was a PhD student at LSE and is starting at Chicago Booth, and Luigi Zingales, who's at Chicago. We were really motivated by the fact that in modern society, there's this clear demarcation between work and personal life that has led a lot of people to fret about not having work-life balance, and even worse, really feeling a kind of deep sense of meaninglessness when they work. And of course, that kind of meaninglessness was an early critique of capitalism. So this is from the 1844 manuscripts, the early Marx, as a diagnosis of what might be happening. And I was actually surprised to find the way that he spoke about alienation of labor was not the way we often think about it, which is the product of one's labor or from other workers, even though those are also effects. But they come from this more fundamental alienation, which is what he talks about here. He says, what then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, that in his work, he does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he's not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. This kind of alienation from the kind of deepest essence of ourselves is part of why effort is modeled in our economic models as very costly. And the solution was to pay people for that costly effort. So if there's this misalignment, let's get the principal to pay the incentives to make the worker do this thing that they don't want to do. And of course, there's been challenges with that. And so there has been a huge surge in alternate motivators of what about connecting them to the mission of the firm or the broader purpose of the firm? And there's a lot of work in practice, but also now growing amounts of papers in economics looking at this. The challenge is, even with this broader kind of mission alignment, all these incentives, old and new, compensate workers for the effort to induce behavior that fulfills the firm's purpose. In this paper, instead, we evaluate a firm's attempt to do the exact opposite, to start bottom up, to ask workers where they find meaning, what their purpose is, and then, kind of in a very risky move, ask if their job and the company aligns with that underlying purpose. So this is with a large multinational that is in consumer goods, so it's Unilever, and I know that there is a Unilever in Colombia as well, that spans multiple countries and jobs. We're gonna look in 14 countries, randomizing within country. So it's a field experiment where we rolled out this Discover Your Purpose intervention, which I'll tell you about. It's an intervention that is meant to connect individuals with their own individual purpose, about their work and personal life. So it's meant to kind of maybe raise dissonance, if there is that, and then create the coherence. And it's not about mission alignment. And so we studied the effect that the intervention has on worker performance and well-being. So just a little bit more about the context. So Unilever is in more than 100 countries, and they started in this old way of thinking about the purpose of the firm. But, and so they do have also a social purpose, but here they really wanted to think about what does it mean to try to activate people's individual sense of purpose. They have 127,000 employees globally. We run the RCT on 3,000 entry-level white-collar workers, so in 14 countries. So think about sales agents, finance business partners, et cetera. So these are all like entry-level, white-collar, college-educated. If I get time at the end or over dinner tonight, I'm very happy to share with you how we're adapting this also for blue-collar workers working in factories and in other environments as well. So the intervention, and I'm going to say a lot more about it, is it involves a period of preparation and reflection where you actually have to prepare for pivotal stories of your life. And you have to ask people within your environment of qualities that define you. So there's a period of reflection. You have to prepare these stories. Then you come into a full-day workshop with 4 or 5 other people, not necessarily from your team. There's only 30% of people who go with their team, but from anywhere in the company with a facilitator. And it's a process of telling everyone these stories and asking people to help you find the through thread and doing the same thing for others. So what you're supposed to do is find the through thread of what makes these stories kind of cohere together and turn that into a purpose statement. Okay, and I'm going to tell you exactly how this happens because it's kind of, when we first heard about this, what is going on? And but just for you to know, there was very minimal academic interference from us. This was an intervention that the company had designed, and they ran. And before and during, it was mainly dictated by the calendar constraints, and it's entirely voluntary. So it's never been used for figuring out which workers are better or high performance. It's something that if you want to take, you can take in the company. So I'm going to tell you about the experimental design, but before I'm going to go much more into detail into the actual intervention. And it involves these 4 stories. So the stories are, when I was young, and this is what you prepare and then you share to others in the workshop. So what you're asked to look at is and you can all think about what you would answer to this, how you would tell this story. So I wanted to just, we took it, by the way. I'll preview it for you. We ended up taking this too, so I'll share with you how it was for me too. But after we got the results, we thought, well, we really, to be able to deeply understand it, we need to take it ourselves too, so we did that. But the question of, when I was young, it's not just like a sentence. You really have to prepare a story to tell. And it's saying, before everyone told you what you should do, what was the thing that lit you up as a child? And then, what is what's called a crucible moment, a challenge that shaped you? What was a story of great success that you had in your life, whether in work or outside work? And what sparks your interest outside work? Okay. So these are the 4 stories. And the way to think about this is, in economics, we've started talking a lot about narratives. This is self-narrative. This is a way of shaping how you tell the story of you. And if you actually try to kind of create a sense of yourself that coheres through these stories. And this is a fantastic book. If anyone's interested in Brunner, we can talk more about the psychology behind kind of self-narrative. But basically what he says is the self-telling of life narratives achieves the power to structure perceptual experience. By the way, I'm so happy that afterwards we have the cognitive economics panel, because I think there's a lot of overlaps here that we can talk through. To structure perceptual experience by telling these stories and retelling them in a particular environment, to organize memory, to segment and purpose build the very events of life. So, just as an aside, storytelling is what we have done for millennia as humans. It's fundamental to how we make meaning in our lives, how we make sense of ourselves, of our world, and of what's happened to us. And we have some really great recent work in economics, including in cognitive economics, bringing this in, talking about the way in which every new experience is interpreted in light of these old stories. And this is based in part on a lot of the neuroscience that, in fact, the same part of our brain that we use to imagine the future is the same as we use to remember the past, that we basically draw factors from the past and reconfigure them to experience the future. So the past is present constantly. And what's really interesting is in looking at sort of some of the social cognition literature, the content of story memories depends on whether and how they are told to others. These reconstituted memories form the basis of individuals' remembered self. So that's how powerful it can be to tell the stories of your life in this particular context. Now, actually, I presented a very short version of this in Mexico City, and Juan Camilo was there. And the question he asked was, what about people who have had, terrible experiences and terrible memories, like in particular Venezuelan migrants who went through harrowing experiences to get here? And so I actually added a slide just for today, being here, which draws on some of our other work, actually, which we did in Colombia, on trauma and the way in which that affects memory. So just bear with me for a second, because I think we can't talk about memory, be here in Colombia, and not talk about trauma and memory. So this is a paper that we did with the city of Bogota, designing a curriculum with a professor of neuroscience and psychiatry with both the victims of the conflict and Venezuelan migrants, to incorporate new methods of how trauma can affect cognition, to incorporate it into training. And so in particular, here's the elements that matter in terms of memory and trauma. So trauma creates these memory distortions which manifest in different ways. The first is sort of overly negative memories and future imaginings, because the way we predict and imagine the future comes from how we pull from the past. And because of these negative memories kind of constantly rising, this also leads to a sense of overgeneral memory. It's actually harder to remember the memories, and a sense of murkiness of the future. So this is what is called in the literature a foreshortened sense of the future. And then, of course, there's the more well-known phenomenon of flashbacks after a certain threshold of trauma. And that can interfere even when you haven't triggered it at all, from just anything that is in the environment and cued there. And understanding this kind of what exactly happens in the brain is very important in terms of, and this is what we really claim in the paper, to become trauma-informed as we design programs for vulnerable populations. So I just wanted to put this out there in case you'll see the results are very strong, and just in case anyone's tempted to go and do this everywhere, when we're talking about memories, we need to be aware of this. And actually, putting these two papers together, as I mentioned, I did the workshop along with Oriana, Luigi, and Virginia, and I was very frustrated, and I couldn't remember stuff from my childhood. And I didn't like these questions of like, who were you when you wanted to light up as a child? Because at 4 years old, I also escaped persecution in Iran, and we had to run, escape. And so I don't remember great memories of childhood, and I have a very overgeneral memory about that. And so, it took me a while to get into that. So it's not that you can't do it, but it is actually something that just needs to be adapted for the environment. So I just wanted to put that out there on this. Okay, so then after you tell the 4 stories, you are meant to find the through thread and crystallize into a purpose statement. So for example, for me, because of these generations of the women in my family who were also, unveiling, mine was to unveil the invisible, or the magic of the invisible. And Luigi, who you may know, really cares a lot about corruption. His was, he loved the Emperor Has No Clothes story as a child, and his was to reveal the emperor's nakedness, or no clothesedness. So it's things like that. Or for example, there was an HR manager who loved fireworks as a child and hated meetings, all the meetings he had to put together. So he thought of himself as a firework coordinator, and that reshaped his particular job. So what happens here is that you either reshape the activities of your job, or you figure out, I'm in the wrong job. I'm really not doing the thing that lights me up, that is really who I am, and you go and find a different job. And that's exactly what people do. And this isn't just like the one-day workshop. There's a really strong reinforcement effect. People use their purpose statement all the time. They often introduce themselves by saying, my name is Nava, and this is my purpose statement. And I think we have some anecdotal evidence that it was used in a lot of the discussions with the managers. You'll see that there was a significant lateral transfers, exits, et cetera. And it's one thing, I just put this here as an amazing literature from neuroscience. Basically, the way you want to think about it is, if you've thought about certain things where once you see them, you can't unsee them. And these experiments come out of a lab in UCL where they didn't ask people about their own goals, they just gave people goals. And they saw the relationship between objects in a radically different way. So if your goal is, you're told your goal is you're stuck on an island and you need to get off of the island, and then you see a wooden chair, whiskey, and matches. When that is your goal, you see the relationship between those three in a very different way. You see the relationship. Basically, that can help you to make a fire and get off of the island. When it's not your goal, you don't see the relationship between those. And so that's kind of the way you want to think about kind of discovering your purpose. And we model this as an effect on the cost of effort, not only of your current job, but also of all the outside options you might have, of all the other types of jobs. And so for some workers, it means the dissonance, they have to actually face that dissonance, and that means their cost of effort rises. So they either leave the company or transfer to another job. And for others, they understand their job differently, and that reframing decreases the cost of effort, raises productivity and happiness. So as I mentioned, these are the 14 countries that we did it in, and unfortunately Colombia was not part of it, but and it was randomized within country, and it was during this period, so it happened while COVID was happening as well, and so at some point the workshops went online, and so we also control for that. It turned out it didn't make a big difference because it was only 4 or 5 people, so it worked really well also online. We followed them for 2 years. So all the effects I'm going to show you, so much of the problem with our nudge literature is just not having long-term effects. And one of our reasons for setting up the lab is to have these long-term collaborations with companies so we can follow employees for a long, long time, and we're continuing to do that now as well. We use global administrative data on performance, scores, bonuses, pay, sales measures to really get an objective sense of productivity, and exits, lateral moves, and promotions. And then we do a series of surveys to measure how employees understand meaning, what effect this has on team collaboration and subjective well-being, to just get a sense of where the self-reports match up to the administrative data. So we do local average treatment effects with the 65% take-up, and we actually, all the effects we can show also with intent to treat. And yeah, I'll just, you all know that stuff, so we can get right to the results. Okay, so the first big result is that there's a very big effect on performance. So, sorry, I don't know why this is. This is the performance rating you get from your manager. Okay, and so it goes from, if you're sort of below 80, you're really a low performing person, and if you're above 125, you're super great, and so you're graded on that kind of curve, and the the treatment group goes up by 3.86 percentage points. And that is really coming from this move from the low performers moving into becoming middle performers. And this is an effect, a performance that lasts for 2 years. At least. So it's a kind of sustained effect that we see. And then we also measure their own self-reports about, do you go the extra mile? And they also report that, so that's consistent with sort of performance scores. The performance scores in these companies have to be justified two levels up. So it's not easy to just give someone that you favor a performance score that's higher. So that also reassured us that this is real. But the other thing that we do is try to take a subsample that is on sales and really look at objective productivity and see to what extent it's correlated. But before I show you that, I'll show you kind of what happens with pay and bonuses. And those significantly increase. So this is kind of the probability that you will get a bonus, that it's above 0, and that it, in the percentiles. And what this kind of shows you, and these pay increases come from people remaining on the same job, and because you'll see that we decompose these performance effects into the people who exit, who are often, as a preview, the low performers, and the people who stay and end up becoming more productive. So what I'm showing you here is the average among them. But the pay increases are important because basically this means that the company was not able to extract. So from one perspective would be companies do these workshops and then they make you do a job that you like a lot more, and then they cut your wages. and I think we have some evidence that in fact it's not the case, that workers are actually making much more than they were before. And here are the results on sort of objective measures of sales performance. And it's an increase from the 50th percentile to the 60th percentile, or about 15%. That's just to calibrate this. If you take Lazier's, famous experiment of introducing pay per performance incentives, or any of the kind of studies we have on that, it's usually an increase of about 20% change in productivity. This is quite a large, sort of on the order of that. And then we try to sort of decompose what that comes from. Is it from better job matching? Is it from the reframing, et cetera? Oh, and I'll just really briefly, we did some back of the envelope calculations on the cost benefit, which tell us a couple interesting things. So this is the facilitation is actually done by volunteers who were employees of the company who'd gone through, who would just take a day off of their job. And so that's what we calculate in. The benefit to the company is the increase in performance and productivity, that we use the 15%, minus what they give to the workers in increases in bonus, which is a 4% increase. And so, it's quite a cost-effective type of thing. Okay, so what we're going to do here is then separate out these performance gains into what comes from selection, so the sorting of workers into different jobs within the firm or outside the firm, and what comes from just greater motivation and increased effort within the job and within worker. And here we follow Lazier, and we're actually able to put in, what we do is we put in worker fixed effects and we put in worker job fixed effects. And that allows us to decompose the performance gains into selection versus effort effects. And so let me first show you the selection margin. So there's a significant increase in exits. And the exits happen actually within 6 months of taking the workshop. And then there's also significant increase in lateral moves. This is very interesting because the culture of the company is that you don't move unless you get a promotion, and people are constantly looking for promotion. So there's a lot of churn actually in the teams, which is very disruptive to productivity on the teams. So this move is a little bit countercultural, to move without needing an increase in pay. And that also happens very quickly after the workshop, and then doesn't happen. So what that tells you is that basically people move, they find a better match for them, and then they stay there. We don't find an effect on promotion. Now that may be because it was only a 2-year horizon, but we're going to continue to follow them and see. So yeah, the exits, this just shows you exactly how this happens, that the exits happen swiftly and then don't happen afterwards. So it's almost like people had this low-lying dissonance in their minds, but they were just kind of getting on with it. And it turns out these are actually a lot of the low performers, which I'll show you in a second. But they were kind of going along with it because they were getting compensated. The workshop made them face this, and then maybe they'd been wanting to make a move, and this kind of gave them the impetus. And then there's not exits after that, and the same with the transfers. It's happening quite suddenly, and then they just remain matched to their right job. Whereas the bonuses continue to increase. I don't know if you can see it's a little bit soft there, but the bonuses continue to increase during the 2-year period. So that increase in motivation and productivity on the job sustains over time. It's not a novelty effect of going through this experience. And so if we put these all together, we're able to, with the worker fixed effects and the worker job fixed effects, we're able to decompose how much of it is coming from these different reallocation and selection. So in particular, we get about 50% of the treatment effect coming from either leaving the company or reallocating to a different job within the company. And the other 50% come from staying on the same job and reframing it for yourself. Okay, and so here's some, robustness checks that, we were able to kind of really rule out a lot of the things that you might worry about. And if there are questions, I'm super happy to ask them. But I want to get to some of the mechanisms because, especially given this audience, it's more exciting. So as I mentioned, we measured meaning, and it's a series of questions that we put into an index on, which are kind of self-reported meaning, which is whatever you want it to be, but also things like, and this is actually the greatest, if you do a PCA analysis, this is the greatest predictor of the index as a whole. And the treatment effect is, I view my work as a chain of obligations. And so that's the big thing that shifts. So there's a lot of interaction here with a sense of agency or autonomy. But so meaning goes up, job satisfaction goes up, and happiness goes up. Now, I want to just point out here that this is on the people who remain at the company. So out of the 3,000 sample, about 200 of them exited the company. So the ones who changed jobs within the company, we're still able to have them in this sample. We don't know if the people who left are less happy or more happy. By revealed preference, once you've gone through the intervention, presumably you would be more happy you've taken a move that would be more happy. But it's a kind of a more metaphysical question. If you knew ex ante that you're now going to confront this thing and it's going to make you see things in a different way, would you do that? And actually, we'd like to be able to follow people now and see on LinkedIn the people who left and see what's happened in terms of their job matching and happiness. The other thing is on this meaning variable, because this workshop is not called, it doesn't say, you do talk about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, so that there's that, but it's really called Discover Your Purpose. But we had these meaning variables that we had put in because we wanted to study this. But of course, everyone has their own definition of what meaning is. And we're now just about to start something where we use AI to use the prompts and allow people to kind of go with different prompts depending on their initial answers to see what meaning is for them. Or whatever it is, it's going up here. We also ask them about what are the aspects of a job that matter to you. And this is a kind of standard thing of when you think about what are good jobs and what people value in a job. And think about helping others, being useful to society, growing and learning skills. And the job priorities change. There's an increase in being useful to society, even though this was about individual purpose and growing and learning new skills. Interestingly, there's a decrease in weight put on work-life balance. And I think that's because work-life balance comes from seeing these things as dichotomous. Think about our work, for those of us who kind of love what we're doing, it's hard to think about what does work-life balance really mean. And I think that's probably a little bit of what's happening here. It's also, interestingly, a decrease in the value put on job security. So we kind of bring this together in thinking about what people are valuing in their job. And to kind of make it simple, we think about what has been talked about all the time as a meaning-pay trade-off, which is on the x-axis is pay that we have of everyone, and then on the y-axis is self-reported meaning on their job. And what you see here is the control group, so a very clear trade-off between how much you're paid and the meaning you face. So the way to think about this is that people who have very low meaning in their jobs need to be paid a larger amount in order to stay in their job. Okay? And that's what the control group shows. Now here's what the workshop does. It flattens the curve. In a way, it makes meaning non-negotiable. And this is coming from the selection effect of people leaving the low-meaning jobs. That is, they're not willing to take the extra income just so that they have more meaning. They think about it and they either match themselves to better meaning, basically. And then just on a other note, when you think about what this is doing, it's essentially taking a kind of individual approach to purpose that's quite idiosyncratic. It's like, what do you like? You personally, who are you? And it's a way that can actually overcome some of the other groups and identities and norms that you might have to feel that you have to oblige by. And the sort of simplest one to look at is gender. So we look at that. And what you see is the same job priorities. So what I showed you just before the meaning pay trade-off gap was the job priorities for everyone. Now we decompose these for men versus women. And what we find is that, in baseline, men and women exhibit the patterns that you see everywhere in terms of what men and women report being the values of the types of job characteristics they value the most. So women tend to say they value a lot more work-life balance and flexible time, and men value more status and learning new skills. And so that makes a big gap between what men and women value at work. That gap after the workshop shrinks a lot. So both people say they want less, they don't really care as much about work-life balance, but men start wanting a lot more flexible time. And women want to have more interesting jobs and more prestige. This isn't just what people say in the survey. We're actually able to look at the decisions they take on the job. And one of the biggest ones is how much leave you decide to take. And so what we see is that the men take significantly more paternity leave. And this is coming because they're feeling sort of emboldened to say, part of my purpose was family, this is what I'm gonna do. We have only 14 countries, so we're very reluctant to do much cross-country analysis, but we couldn't resist, and we looked, because we have another paper that uses some of the same data to look at female labor force participation and gender norms. And we can see that this effect is happening in countries with the most restrictive gender norms, where there is low female labor force participation. And it kind of shows how men are also stuck in these gendered stereotypes and not able to kind of take the decisions that might be what they would really like. Women, on the other hand, they take 1.4 less months. Now, what I don't have here, let me see if I have it. I may not have it. So let me just tell you that we also look at social cohesion, and we look at the inclusion of others in self-scale. We look at your feeling of connectedness to others, your desire to serve. All of those go up. And again, we didn't focus on the social aspect of this at all, but it's a kind of understanding that by getting in touch with the most kind of idiosyncratic of your own, who you are, you feel more connected to the kind of universality of humanity. So we presented this to the company. So in the lab and in my previous work also with governments, we try to follow a model of co-generating knowledge together with practitioners. That means we come up with the questions together and we share data all along the way and we talk about what it means. And we do that with, we have legal collaborations, we're allowed to publish whatever, and have the full independence. But it's also a way in which we learn a lot from their reactions and they are able to organically turn the results of research into policy. In this case, it was very interesting because they had started to roll out the workshops in 2017. And the senior managers were invited first, then the entry-level workers. And so they had certain hypotheses that had built based on what they had seen. And so we can look, actually, to see what has happened in the observational sample versus the RCT sample. And then this is what we showed to the leaders of the firm. So let me show you what the effects are. So this is like on the left is RCT, on the right is non-RCT. So exits in the non-RCT go down. So if you voluntarily select into the workshop, you are more likely to stay, which is what they thought would happen to everyone when they did this workshop with the new virgin countries. It turns out no, if you do the RCT, exits increase. Same with internal transfers. So in the non-RCT, they go down. In the RCT sample, they go up. The performance scores are more alike. The productivity increases in both cases, but the mechanism is very different. And I think when they saw this, it was they realized that a lot of this effect for them was coming from the low performers. Actually, for the people who exit are the low performers, the ones who were actually very low motivated. They were very unlikely to select into the workshop when it was, super. The whole RCT allowed us to get rid of the selection bias, and we could see what the effect is on those low performers. I think what this has done is actually change their approach to this. During this time, there was a lot of changes, a lot of takeover by thinking about cost cutting, and even though they had this sense observationally that some of the performance increases were happening, they didn't have the concrete evidence, and so they had not been pushing the purpose workshop. So they'd had a big turnover and a lot of people hadn't gone through it. And now as a result of seeing this, they actually really want to do it because of course it is profitable for them given the productivity changes. But it was not ex ante obvious to either them or us that would be the case. And actually the exit thing, that was their biggest fear, is that there would be exit, but that they thought it might be of the highest performers and they would go and do something else. This is what I was telling you in terms of team collaboration, overlap. That's the inclusion of others and self-scale. So basically your sense of self increases a lot and you feel more interconnected with others as the result of the workshop. So I'm just gonna conclude this part and then talk a little bit about adapting this. And then I'd really love to have a conversation. One of the most wonderful things, this paper is very new, and as we've been presenting it, it allows a conversation about meaning that we haven't often had in the economic sphere. So I'd love to hear your questions and really open it up. But I think if we think about the kind of broad horizon of work, especially in industrialized countries where there's been stagnant productivity for years and a big productivity slowdown, a lot of a demand for working from home, what's called kind of quiet quitting, where you just stay on the job because it gives you money, but you're just sort of not present. I think that aspect of just not being present, that's exactly what Marx was talking about being not at home in yourself, but you're kind of forced to sit there. So I often think, what does that do to your mental well-being, that you're forced to sit there and just tolerate that sense of being outside of yourself for the long periods of time that we spend at work? And so the way that people manage that is just to kind of not just put in the hours, but not be connected. And overall, I think there's a very interesting literature that's developing on it, but also in the private sector, just a real kind of puzzlement about how do we actually motivate employees. And in particular, the younger generations who really are saying that meaning is non-negotiable. And the results of this paper show that, connecting individuals to their individual purpose and not telling people top down what their purpose should be or trying to overcome their, resistance to working by just paying them more, allows them to actually find better jobs for them and do a kind of horizontal job matching that only they would know how to find. And to overcome gendered societal norms and to improve performance and happiness on the job. And I think for us, the next steps are, along with this paper, in terms of following these guys over time, actually it's a time when, as you all know, there's a huge amount of new technology coming in with AI. And the question here is, to what extent, when someone starts to see themselves, like you do here, as a protagonist of your own life, essentially, able to design your job, your career, even in the face of uncertainty and fear over change, how does that change how you respond to new technologies and kind of fears and opportunities? And then, we had been working for a couple years in factories around the UK to think about how to adapt this for blue-collar workers who did not, in Unilever, who did not respond or resonate with the word purpose. But they really resonated with the word community. That is something that deeply motivated people in these what are called like left behind communities, or in the US, they're the places with the deaths of despair that have been devastated with manufacturing. These are people whose generations of men in their family have worked at these factories. And, Unilever had rolled out these purpose workshops and people laughed at them. And so what we did is we, at being kind of from the outside, we were able to just have some really honest conversations. And what we realized is that purpose and meaning was absolutely present in people's lives. It wasn't a luxury to think about purpose and meaning if you were, just only because you are white collar or you have some kind of salary security. Everyone thinks about it, but they think about it in different ways. And for them, it was about their families and their communities. And so the approach, not only to purpose, but to, helping people reskill or upskill, the kind of standard economic solution to technological change, had not worked because basically it was fear-driven. People were told, you need to reskill because your jobs are going to become redundant. And that didn't work because people don't want to learn under a situation of fear and scarcity. Instead, what we've been piloting is really kind of tapping into the desire to contribute to their community as a way of learning both what their community needs and what they love doing and what they're good at. And then asking them to go out, experience that kind of giving to their community in multiple ways that we're kind of helping them match to, and then reflect on what they would like to learn in reskilling and potentially kind of think about a future career trajectory given the changes that are coming. So that's just a kind of a steer of how we're thinking about adapting this in different environments. And so I'll just leave it here and would love to open up and hear your thoughts and questions.
I'm getting a sense of purpose boost here, so thank you so much for that talk. So with Sandra, sometimes we talk about, she has this expression, replacing your dark glasses with some pink ones, and then more light comes in. So you're replacing it for employees, and so I can see that when that happens to me, I see reality in a new light. But that's also happening perhaps to my manager. So how much of that happens in your sample? That now the person writing the performance review has gone through this, so they write better performance reviews and scores, and they give better bonuses.
Yeah, it's a great question. So most of the managers in our sample have gone through it already because it was rolled out first at the higher level, and then this was, so most of them have gone through, and then this is more, you want to think about this as the effect of you also, and then you being able to use that language in a way that then kind of brings you on the same page with your manager. We don't find, no, we have some variation in whether your manager did it, but I think our sample is too small to really see whether that's a real effect. I think one of the things, we just presented this to the head of HR at Unilever, and one of the things she was really interested in was team dynamics. And we didn't design the experiment to do that, but that's very fascinating of what it might do.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. So I'm curious about two things. The first thing is there are people who left and low performance. I wonder about what type of people there are, whether you have a data about their maybe family, because the reason that I'm thinking about is they probably just want to leave and then without money. So all of a sudden I realized, oh, I found a meaning of my life, but we still have to survive. Right, so maybe the low-paid people might have high income from the spouse. I don't know. That's something I'm curious. And the second one is you said it went through the COVID. Maybe they.
Sorry, do you mean that? I just want to understand. You mean that like they had some other form of security which allowed them
exactly
to then take this move? That
yeah.
is. But what's really interesting is why don't they take the move before the purpose workshop? You know, because the people in the control group, there's the same randomized distribution of people.
Exactly. That's kind of whether you have some data on that to kind of tell us, about those people. And the second one is during the COVID, a lot of work environment changed. Some people work from home and so on. I'm curious whether people are becoming more productive and working less. Because I understand they're, salespeople. They don't have to work 9 hours, 8 hours a day. So if you have some kind of data on that, I'm more curious about, given this, maybe we should think about whether we should force people to work 8 hours every day for 5 days and so on.
Yeah, so the number of hours doesn't change. It doesn't go up or down as a result of the workshop. So I think it's more about what they're doing during those hours that is changing. On your first question, one thing we thought about looking at is, with the caveat of these 14 countries, but in some of these countries, the job is above the median that you get in a job like this. In others, it's below the median. So we can kind of look at that as a proxy for the strength of your outside option. Again, it's randomized within the population, so everyone has, that, but at least that gives you some extent of thinking. Now, if you're forced to confront whether meaning matters or not to you, what are the other factors that allow you to act on that? I think that's what you're getting at, yeah. And also, maybe if you want, you have neither mic there, great. We have some questions here.
I may have missed this, but do you have any data on aspirations and whether the program also leads to an increase in aspirations for the people in the treatment group?
Yeah, great question. I don't think we asked them, where do you see yourself in 10 years or 5 years? We just asked them about the qualities of job they matter, their subjective well-being, how they are now. But yeah, I mean, in the blue collar experiment, actually, they literally, part of it is after this whole thing, they will need to create a future fit plan, which is literally kind of what is the next 5 years going to look like. And it would be interesting to see if they see it very differently.
Okay.
So this is related to the team dynamics question. I'm wondering, so one way to look at it is to look at facilitator fixed effects. Whether some facilitators are more effective than others.
Yeah, so we haven't done that. I think we actually aren't, I don't know if we have the data on who facilitated every workshop because it was so decentralized, but we can definitely look at that. And as you're thinking that, so the thing is that people didn't do it with their teams. Only 30% did with their teams. The other 70% did it with someone, other people in their group were people in the company, but not people they work with. So some of the stories we've heard are, for example, there was a very big dispute between data privacy and like the legal team, and they could not solve it. It was like this big issue. And then one of them went to the other one and they're, oh, you were in my workshop. I know, I see you in a very different light now. And that, we don't have ways of tracking that kind of thing. But are you thinking because the facilitator would create a sense of team? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, actually, and that is something, what we could do is maybe look at if people start doing more cross-boundary collaboration as a result of going through the workshop together, for example, and with who facilitated. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, any other ideas people have, because we're actually at a moment where we can do a lot of new experiments and tracking data. It'd be great to hear those thoughts.
I'm sure you are aware of this. There are reports that were published in the Wall Street journals showing that there was generally a quitting trend around the pandemic, and then it slowed down at the end of the pandemic. So with regards to your study, I'm not sure what will happen if you do the study this period, or how did you factor out that general trend that it occurred during the pandemic and all the way up after the pandemic?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Also because, the Great Resignation, so-called, was relatively short period of time. And it was, because there were tighter labor markets. So it's maybe related to this question of what are the economic conditions that allow you to act on, kind of have a better sense of where you would have a good job match. Maybe one of those is that you have a tighter labor market where you are, and so you can actually have better jobs that you can transfer to, or which jobs you could transfer to. And so I guess there's two answers to your question. One is, again, because we have the control group and the treatment group, it would need to be, if it was really kind of the COVID effect of having a tighter labor market, for example, it would need to be some kind of interaction with being able to do this workshop, because it's not the main effect. And interaction could be that it allows you to take these decisions more quickly. But it still raises the question of how come, the control group was not able to fully take advantage of those conditions. The other is that this sort of we have people post-COVID, we have people in countries where the labor markets were tighter or looser, and the effect sizes are very much similar. And so I think that shows us that even the interaction effect is not a big driver of this, although it's certainly important to look at.
I was wondering if there's an age effect here. That I think that the people you're looking at the study were mainly relatively young, but you would think as people change jobs over their life and more learn what matches their purpose, that they would move towards jobs that were more aligned with their inner purpose in life. I don't know if you can look at it, is there an age effect in terms of how effective this is, and if not, do you think there might be?
Yeah, actually it's in the opposite direction. So it's the people who are actually older, have longer tenure in these jobs, who kind of are confronting that they've been in this and not thought about it very much. And now they need to kind of make a move. So I think, I guess you could keep going in life for a long time without really, you hope that you become wiser, but as I've learned, as I age, I'm not sure that naturally happens.
Next sort of phase of the design? Have you thought about, in the next phase of the design, of thinking about like a placebo condition? Because obviously you have a control condition, you have the treatment, but have you thought about maybe spending one day together, or, sort of, I don't know, having a conversation might sort of generate the same effects?
Yeah, usually in my experiments, I often have a placebo, even, if it's going to shoot me in the foot, because I try to put everything into the placebo possible, to be able to isolate the mechanism. Obviously, we couldn't do that here, and instead we try to really triangulate using all the different mechanisms and outcome measures to say that this is quite different from what you would get from a team building exercise, for example, or any of the many kind of wellness programs. My hope, and one way to look at this is to calibrate against the very small literature that is emerging now of these kinds of programs and the evaluation of them, and so the effect sizes are, significantly more. And things like matching to a different job, for example, or even the exits. You know, you wouldn't expect them. You might expect something like greater team collaboration, greater subjective well-being, even maybe a sustained greater happiness on the job because you feel more cohesion. But the exit and lateral transfers, I don't think you would see those in any of these other types of employee interventions. But this is just a plug for anyone who wants to do work in this space. I just feel like there's so much money and time and attention going into these types of programs and very little experimentation and evaluation guiding it. So it'd be great to build an evidence base.
Regarding your next studies that you mentioned that are going to be focused on blue-collar workers, you said that for blue-collar workers, meaning has a very different sense, and it's more related with community. And I was thinking, because one hears these stories that, for example, Amazon doesn't want their workers to be unionized, but it may actually have a positive side for the company, no? Because if being unionized help building this community sense,
Yes.
and this help blue-collar workers to have more purpose, it might actually be.
Yeah, and to feel, I mean, I think so much of identity used to be based around that. And actually in these factories in the north of England, they are very unionized to the extent where, in fact, in one of them, we really had to be very independent from Unilever to be able to come in and talk to people, as there was a kind of quite big challenges between management and unions. And there's works councils. But as you all know, so that's great in one way, but a big question is, you know, in some cases it creates more polarization, more conflict. And so part of what we've been thinking about is how do we, you know, amplify worker voice and agency in a way that is, you know, really, really constructive and fruitful. But certainly a feeling of solidarity with the rest of the company is very, very important to people.
Okay. It seems a lot of your effect is coming from exit, and exit is not free. It's costly to firms. It's a turnover problem.
Yeah.
Have you thought about a kind of cost-benefit analysis of your interventions here? Do the benefits exceed these turnover costs?
Yeah, let me just show you I went through that pretty quickly so I can go through the back of the envelope. But one thing I should say, and it's not in this one, but yeah, it is here. So the exits we can exactly say what the effect is. There's a 36% of the effect is coming from exits. And then if you include lateral transfers, so exit from the job, it's 50%. Now, if you do the cost-benefit analysis, let's see where it was. I may not be able to get it back. There. So we take this sort of exit rate, which is 7.2 percentage points, and we think about the replacement costs. And so that sort of, again, back of the envelope, but at least it kind of gives us a sense that it doesn't take away the cost benefit. It's certainly a cost to replace people. Now, the interesting question is, are you replacing people with lower or higher productivity? And we're looking at that now in terms of, one thing that's so interesting is that we're not finding, you know, we thought maybe there's going to be some people come in, some jobs that are just low productivity, low meaning, and whoever you get into those jobs, they're just going to be bad. Turns out that's not the case. And what that points to is the really important idea that a lot of value is about the horizontal job matching and really getting, and it's not like sort of good jobs and bad jobs, it really is about people finding their right fit. Yeah.
I was wondering on the experiment with blue collar and all the narrative about classes in the UK, because in the UK, there is a big narrative across classes, and that differs a lot across generations. So I don't know if that's part also why is community more what it matters more than the others, and all the shocks that they have been going through.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a great book in the UK that came out on somewheres and anywheres. So the somewheres were people who lived close to where they grew up, and the anywheres were people who saw themselves as global citizens but didn't, and those were very highly correlated with class. And so, people who are somewheres think about community in a very specific way. And I'm not sure if that was your question about kind of that where that is coming from, how correlated that is with class versus kind of the next generation. I would say I think community is a really important factor for everyone, but again, we define it differently. And it's definitely the case that the people who are in these communities, they have not left for better economic opportunities. So they are valuing something different in staying and trying to still remain in their communities. By the way, this is also something that we saw in Zambia in rural areas, that, we first started thinking about decentralizing recruitment for a new civil service position. And the feedback we got from the government was, you're not going to find people there who are high talent. If they were high talent, they would have left. But instead what we found were people who were high talent, who had 6 O levels, which they could have become a nurse with those kinds of grades and exam scores, but they wanted to remain in their communities. And the thing is, in some ways, you can think whatever you want about where that might be coming from, but that's an amazing resource of someone who's that attached to their community and their family. And our experience in Zambia was that when you helped people who were like that to kind of build a career and then serve their community, the effects on productivity, but there were, they became basically community nurses. The health impacts were very, very large. And so it kind of points to the fact that this attachment to community is a very underutilized, underleveraged aspect of individuals, asset. Yeah, Diego.
Yeah,
Hi.
very interesting, Nava. I'm wondering if you had any conversations with HR, if they have any thoughts on selection. I mean, how will this affect selection in the future? And if you have any thoughts on how this affects like aggregate matching in labor markets more generally.
Right. Two great questions. So we're talking to them about selection and recruitment. It's a natural question of like, wouldn't it be more efficient for people to go through this workshop before they come and they learn about the different jobs, because, and like our labor models, there's always this asymmetric information. It's not usually on the worker side knowing what they love and what they're good at, right? And so, so we're having that conversation now on recruitment. On the labor market, this is also another interesting question, because what we'd like to do is some version of this combined with the community contribution, also for high school students, like at the phase when there's a lot of fixed paths that people end up on, not really knowing what they would really love to do or be good at. And if we can help them to make those matches better, I mean, the idea of a good labor market is that there's, a great kind of horizontal array of jobs. If we start to think about ability as not just a vertical element of, higher talent and lower talent people, but really on this dimension of horizontal talent, let's say, which is a function of what you love to do and what you're good at, it implies that the more different kinds of jobs you have, the more opportunities you have in the job market, the better you can have productivity gains across the market in people's occupational choice.
So it's 4:30. Given that we started a bit late, we're going to take the last couple of questions. If there's none, I'll raise one.
Sure.
So I was wondering, of course, the results in these workshops were not exogenous, no? I mean, the sense of purpose that you revealed during the workshop are not going to be exogenous, but I wonder whether you have thought of exploiting which of these stories, self-stories, the stories that you tell yourself, are more successful in affecting your productivity, whether you can exploit the group that participated in a certain workshop to exploit that part.
So we don't have anything that recorded what they said, but we have, for a very small subsample, we have their purpose statements. And so we do some text analysis, and they have, a wide range of things. There's no clear pattern like for people talking about family or personal things in their purpose statement. Also, the purpose statements like the ones I shared with you, they're kind of not very clear. But actually, the underlying question that you're asking is very interesting, because it's like, what stories, what self-narratives help you be more productive? That's a very interesting way of thinking about it, because I think what we've learned from this paper is that it's just the act of doing it. It's not the actual story, it's not the actual stories. And I think, again, this might come from our underlying conceptual frameworks that guide us on like better or worse. Instead, it's the fact that you go through this process and accept what makes every individual quite unique. And in accepting that uniqueness, allow for better matches and greater happiness.
Yeah,
Okay, just following on that, the first thing I thought of when you were presenting in the introduction, especially the part of the trauma slide, is cognitive process therapy.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, this is not cognitive-based, it's process, and actually for trauma, for those who have been through trauma, we are meant to start writing what we lived, and then reading it, and reading it, and rereading it, and rewriting. So it's very similar in terms, because you're building up your own narrative again. Exactly. So you can actually align that part of the brain, and you are not afraid of what you're going to find, and you are all that. So have you thought about actually implementing something related to the...
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reshaping of memories, even the reshaping of memories, not even like CBT, but the reshaping of memories is actually like a very important therapeutic thing. The professor that we worked with on the visualization, she had pioneered a kind of what's called imagery-based CBT, because the CBT, and I'm sure you've found this as well, it's very cognitively costly to, really look at everything, think about your beliefs, bring up the facts. And so what she did was use imagery and visualization as a path in to thinking about a different way of looking at what's happened to you or what will happen in the future. And in a way, you're kind of creating mental experiences by practicing them in your head. And by doing that, you provide more data for yourself, essentially, of what's possible for you. But you do it in a very multisensorial way. And I think her experience, and from her, she has a number of trials. It's Emily Holmes, in case anyone's interested. It's like, her experience is that this is helpful on certain fronts where it's hard to get through with CBT. But I know there's been some amazing work out of Los Angeles on CBT for trauma, which is fantastic. Cognitive process therapy. Yes. Okay. I'm not as familiar actually with it. Yeah. So it'd be great to talk more. But I think, and I guess what we're going to talk about this in the next panel too, right? It's like, how do we think about the cognitive resources that it takes to do this type of thinking? How do we kind of circumvent or help to lower the costs?
Okay, so join me in thanking Nava for a great talk. And we now have a break until 4:45, a coffee break, and then we'll continue with the panel on cognitive
Okay. Okay. Well, we're going to start with the last panel session. In this panel, we're going to talk about cognitive economics, and we will have 3 speakers that you already know, Ryan, Ian, and Rafael. So in this, we will have, they're going to have presentations of 20 minutes, and we'll have some time to ask some questions after each of the presentations, and at the end we can discuss about it, okay? So please, go ahead.
Well, thank you all for coming to this session, and thanks to the organizers for letting us put this on. This is sort of a new topic, so as was just mentioned, we're each going to give a short 20-minute presentation. We'll have a couple minutes for questions after each one, and then at the end we'll have kind of a general discussion in case there are questions about the general topic of cognitive economics. So our first speaker is Ryan Webb.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I get to go first, which means I get the luxury of defining what cognitive economics is. It's sort of a new label that's come up in the past few years, and in talking to people on how they use it, this is sort of some common points that I came up with that kind of describe this work and the commonalities between this work. And it starts with a recognition that decision-making and some of the precursors to decision-making, like how you collect information and even how you perceive the choice objects, is costly. And that costly means that it's therefore a constrained decision problem and a noisy decision problem. So the noise arises internal to the decision maker. Now this claim in itself that decisions are costly or cognition is costly is not new. It's something that has been around in literature for a long time. But the way that this is sort of distinguished in what is now labeled cognitive economics is that we try to translate concepts and even some tasks from cognitive psychology and computational neuroscience. So in some cases, this means borrowing ideas and borrowing experiments, but in many cases, it actually means that the people who are active in this field are also actively publishing in cognitive psychology and computational neuroscience. And so it's not just a case of importing these ideas from psychology into economics, it's that the underlying principles of how we model perception and decision-making are going back and forth across these fields. Another commonality is that the source of the behavioral anomalies that we try and study are not claimed to be due to preferences, rather they're claimed to be due to these constraints and noise. And so one example that Mark Dean gave when he was giving a talk here a couple days ago was the random preferences versus random attention, right? So if you observe someone on one day choosing an apple and another day choosing an orange, you might say, well, maybe just one day they preferred the apple to the orange and the other day the orange to the apple. An alternative explanation might be that on the day they chose the orange, maybe their attention was allocated in a different way, perhaps even randomly, and that's what caused them to choose the orange on that day. And that obviously has normative implications, right? Because if we observe people switching choices not due to preferences but due to something else, then that means that there might be some intervention we can make to try and help them make a decision to maybe sometimes choose the apple more often. And a final commonality, and I say this is a sufficient but not necessary condition, is that a lot of these ideas is that the behavior might be an efficient response to these costs or internal noise. And so there's some optimizing principles at work here, and two of the literatures that sort of are related here is rational inattention and efficient coding kind of use these optimizing principles to try and explain some of this behavior. Now, of course, there are people who are not working in these paradigms who I think would still some work would fall under this label, so it's not necessary, but Rafa, for instance, will talk a lot about the work in efficient coding and trying to relate some of these ideas. So I did kind of put together a list of literature in which some of these ideas have been applied. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but I did want to get across, and I sorted it sort of from studies that look at sensory perception specifically all the way down to grocery shopping, which is the topic I'll be talking about. And so you can think of these as departures away from the underlying principle of perception and moving towards more general ideas of decision making. So we have sensory decision making, we have the perception of numbers, then this work went naturally to the perception of lotteries. So if people are perceiving numbers in a way that's not, there's some constraints in their perception of numbers, maybe that means that there's some constraints in how they're evaluating lotteries. And there's some work suggesting that the types of studies in which we evaluate risk preferences, the fourfold pattern, for instance, like risk aversion and loss aversion, might not be due to preferences per se, but might be due to this perception and aggregation process that arises in the brain. Rafa is going to talk a lot about this work, so I won't get into it in any of the details. Instead, I want to talk about an example of these ideas in grocery shopping, and that's the paper I'm going to talk about today. So this paper is with Colin Kammerer and Peter Landry, who I've worked on the topic of habits before, and Clarice Zhao and Matt Osborne, also at Toronto, although Clarice has now moved to McGill. And the topic is on the study of habit. And we're going to be looking in particular in the domain of canned tuna fish. And so the reason we're focusing on canned tuna fish in this study is because in 2008, all the canned tuna producers shrunk the size of their can. And so this provided some nice variation to think about how people might be jolted out of a habit based on some exogenous variation in the environment. So to sort of set the ideas, I want you to think about going to the store to buy canned tuna fish. And maybe the first time you go to the store, you'll look at the canned tuna fish aisle, and you'll look at all these cans, and you'll look at all the prices, and maybe you'll pick up a can and you'll look at the label to see if it's got some ingredients that you might be interested in or not interested in. And maybe you select the blue one there, the Star Kissed up in the top left. You make your selection, you walk out of the store. The next time you come to this same aisle, maybe you look at a different can and you pick a different can because maybe the price was lower. The second time you come back, the third time you come back, maybe now you've selected the yellow can a couple times in a row, and now maybe when you go to this aisle, you pick up the can and you just don't even pay attention to the prices and the rest of the cans. You just know, I like the yellow can's the one that I want, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to move on. So you sort of to ignore the rest of the choice environment and just focus on the thing that you're purchasing. And then one day you walk up to buy the yellow can, and now the can has shrunk. Literally, the can producers have shrunk the size of the can. And you're like, oh, this is different. So maybe now I'm going to switch, or maybe now I'm going to look at all the other cans, I'm going to reallocate my attention here and consider other cans, and maybe now you re-optimize it and make a different decision. So that's kind of the way we want to be thinking about choices in this setting, and we want to think about the nature of habit. That habit is going to be a process in which after you choose something for a long period of time and the environment's relatively stable, you're just going to repeat that choice. But then when something happens, there's some variation or some surprise, then you might try to reallocate your attention and re-optimize your choices. So there's a wide and implicit recognition that habits are important for behavior. There's a couple of 2 points that I kind of want to emphasize that I think people would all agree is a property of a habit. The first is that habitual behavior is persistent. So there's a sense in which you repeat a behavior, it starts to become habitual. And the second is that there's some normative foundation for habits. And this is Becker in a paper on habits I'll talk about in a second, proposed that there was some normative foundation for habits. And in the pure Chicago style, he said, we observe habits, therefore they must be an optimal response, but never really defined what that optimal response was in reply to. And so that's kind of what we want to try and focus on here, is to try and provide some kind of normative foundation for why people might have habits. So the current approach to habits in economics, when I say habits, you might be thinking about this model, is the model of state-dependent utility. So habits are typically modeled as preference complementarity over time. So if you choose something one day, you're going to like it more the next. And so this is typically looked at econometrically as you define the utility function as a function of lag choices. And so maybe there's also some attributes for the product and some prices, but conditional on those, the more that you've consumed it in the past, the higher your marginal utility, the more likely you are to make a purchase in the future. And this captures the empirical feature of choice persistence that is prevalent when you look at consumer choice data. So across a wide number of categories, you find that this coefficient on lagged choice is highly significant. But what this model doesn't have is a role for habit to reduce cognitive effort and attention. So if you think about this as a utility maximization model, that means on every time you walk into the store, you are going to observe the utilities of all the cans and you're going to optimize. There's no role for you to ignore things. And all choices in this model are going to use all available information. And so that's kind of what we want to move away from, is this idea that attention is allocated to all products. So our approach to habit is going to build on the concept of habit from psychology and neuroscience literature. I'm not going to go into all the empirical studies here, but recently we put out a working paper with a number of psychologists, neuroscientists, marketing people, and economists sort of outlining this literature. And instead what I want to do is boil down some of the insights from this literature into a model for you. And so I'll just present the model which sort of extracts these key features. So our approach to habit we call neural autopilot. There are two decision-making modes. The first mode is the habitual mode, is just to repeat the current choice. Or sorry, repeat the previous choice, the choice that you made last time. And the second mode is the model-based mode. Really, it's just utility maximization. So the consumer is going to learn and form predictions about utility. So they're going to observe the utility and they're going to form a prediction based on their past utility realizations. And they'll enter a habit mode when the outcomes are reliable. So when the outcome that they observe matches their prediction, they're going to enter a habit. And they'll exit a habit when doubt about the reward prediction exceeds some threshold. So if they have some surprising outcome and that exceeds some threshold, now they're going to go back to utility maximization. And this idea that this doubt, this reliability of the signal is going to control these two decision modes actually has foundation in neuroscience, in which there's a reward reliability signal that arbitrates between two different modes of decision making. So this is actually the first time in my life I've written down a dual process model after years of claiming that there was no dual processes. So this is an adventure for me as well. Not so for Colin. Now the implications here are that consumers are going to be price sensitive. They're going to attend to prices when the environment is unstable, and they're going to be habitual when it's stable. And that's going to be sort of the key empirical feature. And the questions that we can use to answer with this model is the choice persistence that we observe in the data, is it due to automaticity? Is it due to habit, or is it due to state-dependent utility? So is it due to attention, or is it due to preferences? How does the product size influence persistent behavior? So we're going to look at the effect of the can change and the effect of essentially the effect of shrinkflation. How does the economic environment influence habit versus not? So when the price environment is really volatile, are people more likely to be optimizing? And then what is the proportion of choices made in habit? So I'll quickly take you through the model. It's relatively simple. It's composed of 3 parts. So the consumer, anytime they make a choice, they're going to make a choice, they're going to observe some utility, and then they're going to form some prediction about the product based on the utility they observe. So the utility they observe is the U, and the prediction is the R. They form a prediction for the thing that they purchase. If otherwise, the predictions stay constant for all the things they don't purchase. If you don't like this idea of forming predictions, the parameter rho is just going to control the weight of the last utility observation, so immediate learning is just rho is equal to 1. The second feature is reward reliability. So when the consumer walks up to the shelf, they're going to observe the can, they're going to observe the utility of the can, they're going to compare it to the prediction. If that difference, that surprise is large and accumulated over time, surprises get accumulated in this thing we call a doubt stock. If the doubt stock gets large enough, then they'll go to maximize utility. However, if the doubt stock drops below threshold, meaning that there's few surprises or accumulation of surprises that's relatively low, then they're going to enter into a habit. And the habit here is just repeating their choice. So one thing to note is that this threshold parameter here, theta, if it's 0, then we just have the standard random utility model. So what this model is going to allow us to do is to test with a nested test the effect of this habit mode versus the standard random utility with lagged state-dependent utility. Okay, so a little bit about the data. In 2008, the 3 major canned tuna brands reduced their package sizes from 6 ounces to 5 ounces. They all did this within 1 year. And it was not a coincidence that this all happened across the 3 brands. There was actually a lot of price fixing going on at the time. This guy here was the CEO of one of those brands. He ended up going to jail for this price fixing scheme. I don't know if you can read at the bottom, but he says, this is the New York Post, Christopher Leshevsky has been convicted of 1 felony count in the fishy scheme. Now he'll be the one spending time in the can. The second message of this is don't trust guys with long hair. So this is the introduction of the cans across the 1-year period. So brand 1 moved first. We're not allowed to actually name the brands, but brand 1 moved first. Brand 2 and 3 moved second and third relatively close. But you'll see that this all happened relatively quickly, but there is some variation across stores and therefore consumers and when this can was introduced. Here's a graph that I think is more important. This plots market share and price per can. In the gray there is when the new can was introduced. You can see when that new can was introduced, the relatively stable market becomes relatively unstable in the sense that there's a lot of switching behavior happening. For prices are relatively constant beforehand, and then when the can introduction starts happening, they start to go up. So there's 2 things happening here. There's the can size dropping and the price per can going up. So consumers are actually getting it from both ends here. Now what this means is that we do observe obviously the can introduction and the prices, but both of these things can influence the behavior because both of these things enter utility in our model. Which I have here. So here's the utility specification. So the utility for a product is a function of price. It's a function of a bunch of observables for the can, including its size. And then we also have this lagged state-dependent utility term, which is the standard interpretation of habits. And so we're going to embed this in the model, and therefore we're going to be able to test for which of these 2 sources of automaticity or persistence are related to the persistent behavior. Okay, so I have 5 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, so I'll just relatively quickly take you through the results. On the left 2 columns here are the base logit and logit with lag choice. So this parameter here, the 0.83, the lag choice is the standard interpretation of choice persistence. In column 4 is our autopilot model. And I want you to notice that the theta parameter is much larger than 0. And the log likelihood for that model is much lower than the lag choice. So what that means is that we're finding evidence for this automation and behavior, and we're finding that it's a stronger explanation for the lag choice that we observe in this, the persistence we observe in the data than the logit with lag choice. In column 5, we include the lag choice parameter, and you see that it drops by about half. So that means that there still is some persistence operating through preferences, but the majority of it is operating through this automation channel. This third column I think is the most interesting because it essentially, we call it a mixed logit. Essentially what it means is sometimes you're optimizing, sometimes you're automating, but it's just random when you do so. And we find that that's actually the worst model. And what that means is that what's critical here is when you are automating. And you're automating when the environment is stable rather than when it's unstable. And that's sort of built into our model, and that's what's generating the results. So we can measure how often consumers are choosing habitually. In this market, they're choosing, I want to focus on the bottom graph here, that's our most favored model. They're habitual about 10% of the time. A small effect from the can size, a much larger effect if we hold prices constant. So that means that most of the effect is coming through price stability rather than the size of the can, which again is an explanation for why consumers don't react to shrinkflation, is that this change is small enough that they might not be reacting to it. Now, is tuna the best place to look for habits? Probably not. People don't purchase it very often, but we looked at orange juice as well. People purchase orange juice much more often, maybe more likely to form a habit, and we get an estimate of around 25% of consumers are habitual for orange juice. So just very quickly, I'll take you through the implications. I got 0 minutes. The first is on measures of price elasticity, right? If we include this model of habit, then our measures of price elasticity have to change because the implications of the price sensitivity parameter are different. And the second is welfare, right? If demand is inelastic to small changes and consumers don't react, then that means the firm can essentially make small changes to the product and decrease the welfare of the consumer. And I want to actually, the first 3 points are just basically what I said, and I want to summarize with the last 2 points. What this model implies is that habitual choices do not use all available information, but they also don't require some cognitive effort. So they might be rationally inattentive in some settings, right? You can imagine it's costly to make decisions, and sometimes you want to shut that off and just repeat your behavior in stable environments. But the other thing to keep in mind is that these habitual systems that our brains have evolved, they're common across many species. I didn't touch on this literature, but they're common in species from rats all the way up to humans. And so that means they didn't evolve in environments in which you have marketers like titrating the amount of product very slowly to sort of influence your decisions. And so although they might be efficient in sort of their adapted setting, they might not be efficient in other settings. And this is an explanation used to explain choices in risk in a recent working paper by Netzer, Steiner, Robson, and Kosarek, which I encourage everybody to go read because it's really interesting. All right, so that's all my time.
Thank you, Ryan. I don't know, we open the space for a couple of questions. There is a question or no? Well, so
we got lots of time for questions after.
At the end, we can ask questions.
Okay, so our next speaker is Rafael Polania from ETH Zurich.
So I think we need a presentation coming up. While presentation comes up, so I just want to repeat something I mentioned in my first talk in the introduction workshop of the conference, and it is that for me it is a very special moment to be here, given that I graduated from electrical engineering back here at the engineering building here at the University of Los Andes. And I would have never, ever imagined that I would come back here to give a talk in economics. So, and actually, especially now that I'm going to tell you how we can actually use concepts of neuroscience to try to understand how our very private subjective preferences emerge and how we can actually measure them to better make predictions about future choices. And to do that, so maybe let me start with a soccer example. Right now, a lot of soccer is going on around the world. And if maybe you remember, so just some few years ago, it's incredible that the whole world was celebrating soccer as a one unified world in Russia. And it's crazy that all of this madness is happening right now, but I'm not coming here to make a political statement, but rather to tell you, use this as a motivation to introduce my topic. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a Colombian. And turns out that my wife is Polish. And the big boy that you see here is Alejandro, our son. So he was a few months old back then when the World Cup was taking place. And turns out that these two teams were facing each other in the group phase. And so both of us wanted him to wear our t-shirts, national t-shirts. But, I told to my wife, hey, I don't want to fight with you. He has to make the decision. And as you see, well, maybe he made the right choice. And actually, very well so, given that day we want 3 to 0. But what I want you to think about this example is maybe what was going on through Alejandro's little head when he was actually facing this choice. And something you may imagine is that maybe he's associating, past experiences, memories, and emotions relative to these two things, right, these two objects that he had to choose from, to all of these past experiences, right? And actually it turns out that one of his favorite toys back then had the patterns and colors of the Colombian t-shirt. So you may think, okay, maybe that's one reason of why he decided in that way. But also what I want to ask you to think here about is that, this little head, right, has not, let's say, infinite power to process all of the information, all of the past experiences that he has been having during his short life. And it is well so because, we have a very, very limited budget to operate. So our brains are extremely, extremely efficient, right? If you compare how much our brains consume in a given moment to what your mobiles consume and what they can do, and even more if you consider that all of what your mobile phones do happen in the cloud, that a lot of power, you start realizing it's really incredible that what our brains can do with such a limited budget. And this is actually the point of departure of what we like to study. So we want to understand, or we like to understand, how we can make decisions under such deep resource constraints. And let me just tell you then a bit about how I was seeing this so-called field of neuroeconomics when I started to dive into this. And let me start with this example. So let's suppose that I show you this apple. And I will ask you a purely perceptual question, right? I ask you to estimate, for instance, what's the color of this apple. So what happens is that you see this object, right? Something happens in your brains, right? So some sort of activity pops up, and then finally, maybe you make an estimation that I will call here apple hat, right? Of what's the color of this apple. If I would present you a pear, right, you would maybe do the same. And if I ask you instead now, which of these two fruits is more red? Well, maybe you make an estimation of the color of this, you make a decision. Right? But now imagine that instead of me asking you, what's the color of this apple, I ask you how much you would like to eat this apple. And what we like to think here is that maybe something very similar happens. You see this apple, something happens in your brains, and you make an estimation of how much you like this versus how much you like this. And maybe what we do as, as researchers, economists, or cognitive scientists, we try to model, right, the noisiness of these decisions and finally try to generate predictions of what you would do if you would have this information, right? And in the field of, let's say, of economics, to be more precise, you use this information to try to understand our behavior, and this maybe has influences all downstream to social aspects of life and so on. But there is a problem, and it is the fact that these estimations that we make here are usually very much biased. There is a lot of variability, right? So these estimates that you obtain here, maybe when you ask for how much you would like to pay for it, how much you like it, is not the ground truth price as you would find in the perceptual problem. So what I want to tell you is that these observed estimates are not exactly the same in the field of economics as this unknown, what I would call true value, that may potentially lead to these estimations, right? And typically, perceptual and cognitive neuroscience deals with this side of the screen, while in economics, you typically depart from here to try to model behavior. But what I want to tell you is that maybe it's really, really important to consider what's happening early on before you try to use models to try to explain behavior here, which might be not completely correct. So the computational approach, right, we have to start to make assumptions if we want to make some progress here. And typically we, in cognitive neuroscience, we assume that this process of estimation and deciding has two stages. The first one is representing information, right? You see something, your brains represent this based on memories, emotions, or maybe the pure sensory perception you see here, then you have to interpret the signals, right? So the fact that you see some activity in your brains does not mean anything if you don't interpret it. Okay, so there is some interpretation that we call decoding of the information that is happening here. And how do you encode this information? Well, here we will use this principle of efficient coding that is nothing else that telling us that we need to take into account the fact that the amount of firing rates that you see in the brain and the more information you can acquire to make a decision is not infinite, is very much constrained. The second part tells you, well, we have to do something with that, and maybe there you may think, well, maybe we are somehow rational. We try to use as much as possible this information from together with our past experiences to try to act and infer and then decide. Okay? So let me tell you what I mean by efficient, right? So I gave this example before, but I think it's a beautiful example to understand how we try to model resource constraints during decision making. So what you see here is the Morse code, you may recognize it, and the problem back then during the war times was that we were only allowed to transmit only short or long beeps. So what was the goal? Maximize the amount of letters you would transmit per second. So how would you optimize this problem? It's very simple. All you have to do is to simply assign shorter transmission codes to the most common letters. In this way, you will be way faster, for instance, in the English language. That's why the Morse code has shortest codes for letters like A, E, M, and N. They occur very often, so it's reasonable to assign shortest codes to those, while letters like W, X, Y, Z don't occur very often. Well, so why do you want to waste resources to try to assign shortest codes to those letters, right? So in biological and psychological terms, all this means is that we want to be more sensitive to events that happen more often in the environment. And that's what we believe our brains are doing every single time you perceive, you infer, and you decide. Now, so we try to make a point about this theory, probably in the most difficult possible way, trying to infer, for instance, subjective preferences about what you would like to consume. So let me tell you about the common setup in such experiments, right? We invite participants and we ask them to rate how much they would like to consume a set of items that we present on the screen. So this is always incentive compatible, so the participants come to the lab fasted, right? So they come a bit hungry, so all of this is fully incentivized, and they are motivated to make the actual decisions for food. And then at the end, after they face a series of decisions, we randomly choose one of the items they chose, and they really have to eat it in the lab in front of us. So how the experiment looks like? So typically, first we present a series of items from the most common, from their favorite supermarkets. In this case, in Switzerland, there are two main big chains, and we took a random sample of those items. And first, we asked them to rate how much you would like to consume this item from completely disliked to like it a lot, right? So they had to place a rating here. And we did it in two ways, one without numerical cues and one with numerical cues, right? And we repeated this 2 times for all of the 60 items. So what we wanted to measure here is the amount of variability, right? Every time I ask you, you will maybe choose a different rating, a different number, right? And the question there, is this noise that you observe really random, or does it really influence our decisions? This noise is really informative. You may think, well, this noise may be because our mouth is noisy, our muscles are noisy, has nothing to do with the estimation process, but maybe it has a lot to do. And what you see, what happens here is that the rating scale simply normalized from 0 to 1, but you see that there is some variability that starts to be larger towards the center of the scale and disappears on the edges. And the question is this variability influencing our future decisions? So after they made the ratings, we asked them, we were presenting 2 items at the time, and we asked them to choose which of the 2 they wanted to consume. So what we did was to run a regression where we put here VD is the value difference between the 2 items. Variability is the variability that you observe for each item, for each rating. You simply added up the variability of the 2 items they were choosing from. And here V is the overall value of the items. We wanted to control for that. But what you observe is very well, yes, so the value difference had a positive coefficient, very much significant. That's good news because it means that they were often choosing the item they liked the most. Okay, so that's all good. But what is important to realize here is that the more variability they had in the ratings, the more mistakes they would make at choosing the item they liked the most. So it means that this noise here was really relevant for making their decisions. And the same was true, was at the trial by trial level, the same was true across participants, right? So the more noisy they were, the more mistakes they would do at choosing what was, the most palatable item for them. So how do we try to model that in an objective manner while considering resource constraints? So we assume that somewhere in your brains, you have a virtual scale where you order items from completely dislike to like, but given a context. So if I tell you that you are right now facing items from your most favorite supermarket, then that's your context, and that's how you align your items. There is some virtual scale that you use for that. And now let's suppose that they present you one random item from this distribution of items you may face in this context, in this case, carrot. Then there is a process of perceiving it, inferring it, right? So you find the probability that you will have some activity in your brain, given that there is a true value that generates this activity. Important to consider here is that this model will consider, well, you have a finite set of let's say, firing rates to perceive and give the rating of this item. Then what we assume is that there is a decoding stage, right? You represent this in your brains, then you pass this through a Bayesian decoder, right? There is some evidence that the brain performs operations that look Bayesian when estimating and inferring the world from the cognitive and perceptual literature. And then, once you have formed this objective value, you have to place it somewhere in your rating scale. Now, here is important to realize that these rating scales, right, are usually finite, right? So they are not infinite in range, right? So we are constraining always our participants when we perform experiments to have a finite rating scale that goes maybe from dislike to like. So there is some mapping function that maps this objective value, estimated, not the real one, and that's the most important part, right? So whatever we observe here is never the ground truth, right? It's a biased and potentially variable estimate of this thing. But this thing we don't know, right? So how do we try to find your true preferences? Only by observing choices. Well, ideally we can come with some sort of likelihood function, right? And turns out that mathematically we can fully invert this process to try to find what's the likelihood that given that you observe this rating, it most likely came from what I call a truth subjective value that generated this thing. And turns out that yes, using a very well-constrained optimization model, you can come up with an expected value of this rating that you may observe for a given item, V0, and also you can obtain expressions for the variability that you will observe in your rating scale. And this is good news because it means now we can plug this into a likelihood function that assumes a mapping to the rating scale, and we can use data to invert this process and discover the prior and what I call the truth subjective values that generate this thing that we observe here. Now the question is, can this thing allows us to predict future choices, right? So what we do is to discover these true subjective values and priors. We tied our hands as researchers, use the information you obtained from these discovered true values using the expectations and the variability to try to predict whether you will choose this or this. And turns out that this model does a very, very good job at predicting whether you are going to choose as a function of the value difference between the two items and, for instance, the addition of the values of the two items. And you may ask, okay, is this useful at all? And I tell you yes, and a lot. If you use the standard logit functions and any other, we tested, believe me, like tons of models, nothing was coming close to be better relative to the model of resource constraints by discovering what I like to call these objective values. So it's very, very important to consider resource constraints and moreover, try to discover the true values that generate those estimates that typically sorry to say, economists use, let's say, to then implement their models to try to infer choices in the future. So I have 3 minutes, that's great. So let me tell you very, very shortly about illusions. So, all of you may have experienced, sit on you have maybe, experienced what you call perceptual illusions, right? But let me tell you that this type of model also, let's say, generates a prediction of an illusion of subjective valuation. So how does it work? The more noise you have in your system, the more variability you will have, maybe might be obvious, but also more biases you will have in your estimations, according to the theory we implemented. So what happens, right? This black line here, the flatter one, is the scenario. If I ask you, well, tell me what's your estimate versus the true value that maybe I don't know, right? But then I can simply say, okay, what was your estimation for a given value here on the rating scale versus the one you gave me, right? And what you see here is that you overestimate the true values when you don't like so much the things, but the opposite happens for things that you like a lot. But if I now inject a lot of noise in the system, then these biases, not surprisingly, get larger. But this model predicts the following. The more you dislike the thing, the more you will like it if I give you time pressure or more noise in your system. The opposite happens here, but just here that this bias kind of inverts, right? It's like it flips. And this is a prediction from the prediction from the model. And now, the problem is the same as before. We then never know the true values B0 that generate these estimations. But we can apply a trick to solve that problem, right? If we subtract these two things, we get rid of the V0s, the true values, and I simply get a difference of the two estimates when you have high noise versus low noise. And then you simply can subtract these two curves here, and you get a new curve, right? That is the difference between these two things, where it will happen the same thing. You will have an attraction, right? It means that you will overvalue things that you don't like much. If I give you time pressure, or if I make the object more noisy in the screen, the opposite happens here, right? So you will like it less. You will tell me that you like it less, and the opposite will happen here, right? So how do we implement this manipulation in the lab? Very, very simple. All what we did was to simply, for some round of ratings, present the item for very short time, only 900 milliseconds, and other times we were presenting the same items for a bit longer. And all we had to do is to simply compute the difference between the two ratings to maybe try to obtain such a trace for many, many items. And that's exactly what we observed, right? So just to, let's say, stretch it a bit, right? If you would be a marketing person, if I want you to like an item a lot, but it's placed on the side where you don't like them much, just present it by short time, and automatically you will like it a lot. And the opposite would happen here, right? So if you would be a marketing person, don't present them for short time if that person, you suspect that person likes this item a lot, because you will have this effect here of less liking. But the opposite happens towards the setting of the scale where you have the majority of your density function for the objects that you have. And then maybe just let me summarize, right? So basically a formulation, right, where a Bayesian decoding constrained by efficient coding, meaning by considering constraints in your resources, naturally explains variability in judgments and decisions, where this formulation first predicts and provides an explanation for variability in our evaluations. Second, allows the discovery of what I like to call true values, right? Where we call that the experimenter never has access to those unless you implement such an experiment. Third, and provides a unique and clear link between variability in subjective evaluation and choices that you may make in the future, okay? And in addition to this, it explains a series of biases or irrationalities that you may label as irrational if you don't have such a framework. And then our results simply imply that maybe there might be indeed universal rules that govern the computational processes underlying human perception, but that those could be very well translated also to economic behavior. Where what we want to have in this case here is maybe have models that take into account the goals of the organism, its environment, and also its biological constraints. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafa. I think given the time constraint, we can continue.
Maybe one question while we switch presentations?
Okay. Yes. Well, there is one question. Any?
Otherwise, we can take them at the end.
We can discuss at the end as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, thank you for sticking around to the end. So this paper is much more preliminary than the first two. This is a new project in my lab, and this is a joint project with my grad student Irfan Khan. Irfan, do you want to stand up? And so Irfan deserves all the credit, and I deserve all the blame. Before we get into this specific this paper on discretization, I want to zoom out a little bit and say a few things about cognitive economics. So if you Google decision neuroscience, the first two tasks that pop up on an image search are these two. And so this one on the left is what we tend to study in economics and judgment and decision making. It's all about preferences and biases and heuristics and things like that. So but the focus is on utilities and do we prefer a chocolate chip muffin or say a bowl of fruit, very much like kinds of tasks Rafa was just describing. But at the same time, there's been this parallel literature in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience studying tasks more like this one, where in this case this monkey is trying to decide whether these randomly moving dots are moving more to the left or more to the right. And the focus in this literature is a lot more on the psychophysics, the psychophysical functions, and specifically on noise in those functions. And there's been a lot of work in that literature on sequential sampling models, or in particular the drift diffusion model, which assume that information or evidence is gathered over time and averaged over time to sort of average out these effects of the noise that's coming in at each point in time. So you gather evidence until you hit one threshold or the other, and that's when you're sort of confident enough in your choice. And over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of work starting to merge these two distinct literatures and starting to say, well, what if this kind of process is really going on in the kinds of choices that we're interested in, the preference-based choices? So that's sort of part of the motivation, at least, for this topic of cognitive economics is can we use these models of noise and how we deal with noise to better understand economic choice? Now, I want to take a minute here to acknowledge another researcher we lost this year. So, Danny Kahneman, while not a frequent attendee of the ESA meetings, obviously had a huge impact on our community. And he's probably everybody knows this book that he wrote a few years ago, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about prospect theory and heuristics. But you might have also seen his more recent book, his last book, which was this book on noise. Right? So he was in this book, he's acknowledging the importance that noise also has in our decision making. And a few years ago, I actually had the pleasure of having an email exchange with Kahneman, and having worked on the drift diffusion model for many years and bringing it to economics, I was really happy to see this statement from him in our email exchange, where he wrote, "I've long been convinced by the drift diffusion model of choice between multiple alternatives." So I put a smile on my face. But I'm not here today to talk about the drift diffusion model. Instead, I want to talk about evaluation and discretization evaluations. So if you're like me, you've been wandering around Bogota and you've been seeing these beautiful baskets and maybe thinking to yourself, what would I be willing to pay for this basket? Now, if you're Colombian or from Bogota, you might say, well, that's worth, to me, that's worth, $78 or, $112 perhaps. If you're not from here, you might say, well, $100, maybe $150, right? So depending on your expertise, depending on your familiarity with these objects, you might be more precise in your willingness to pay for these items, right? But I very much doubt that any one of you said, my willingness to pay for this bag is, $87.33, right? We just don't use that, we don't get that level of precision when we're making estimates like this one. Now that's just an anecdote, but I can show you some data on this. So this is a paper I published in 2012 where we showed Caltech undergrads a bunch of consumer products, including DVDs, sweatshirts, electric razors, and we asked them to type in their willingness to pay for these various products. And what I'm showing you here is the histogram of those willingness to pays. And what jumps right out at you when you're looking at this histogram is these very discrete spikes at round numbers, right? So people are saying $5, $10, $15, $20, $25, $30, etc. There's very few observations in between. There's occasionally some, so there's some experts at these consumer products, but most of them are rounding to the nearest $5 or $10. Okay, so that's what we want to understand: is why are people binning these values? Why is this distribution not sort of smooth? Okay, and in neuroscience in neuroeconomics over the last decade or so, we've been trying to understand how the brain computes value. And the dominant model has been that there are neurons in our reward system, like ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the striatum, that respond to value, and so the activity of these neurons rises as we're confronted with valuable objects, and then so it's like a thermometer. So the activity goes up, and then when it reaches some level, and we just read out that level. And if you believe that model, then if you ask people for their willingness to pay, we should see a smooth and continuous distribution of values of willingness to pay, and that's again not what we see. But if you read the literature on perceptual neuroscience, sensory neuroscience, that there's other computations that neurons in our brains make. Rafa mentioned this example during the workshop, but for instance, if we take perception of orientation of lines, we know that there are different neurons in our brain that respond, that sort of detect different orientations. So this is an example of a neuron that fires each of these lines is an action potential. So this neuron is a neuron that gets excited or is sensitive to vertical lines as opposed to diagonal or horizontal lines. There are other neurons that are sensitive to horizontal lines. They would fire a lot for horizontal lines, but not for vertical or diagonal lines. So in these sorts of systems, we have neurons that essentially are categorical, right? They're discrete. They respond to discrete types of perceptual stimuli. And so perhaps this is also what's happening in the value-based domain. Perhaps we also have neurons that are sensitive to high-value objects, medium-value objects, low-value objects, and that's what's behind this sort of discretization of these continuous value spaces. Okay, so there's been a lot of work again over the years, especially the last few years, on adaptive coding of value, which Rafa and both Rafa and Ryan have worked on, and also optimal inattention. So this idea, that we might not be getting perfect signals of value, or processing fully precise signals of value. So, but a lot of this literature has focused on choices, the net outcome of being binary choices between objects. What we want to focus on in this paper is what are the implications of these constraints or these processes for continuous valuation. So imagine we have a value detector. Okay, so imagine we have like a machine that examines objects, consumer products, for instance, and then assigns those products values. Okay, so it has literal labels that it can attach, but it has a limited number of labels, right? If we want more labels, that's going to be a more expensive machine. And so the question is how many bins should we have, right? Given the parameters of the decision problem, of the valuation problem, how many bins do we want this machine to have? Okay, and there's two major considerations that come into play here when we're addressing this question. The first is the stakes. So how important is it to precisely label the stimulus, right? If we assume that our payoff is going to increase as the label that we assign gets closer to the true value, then it matters sort of what is the multiplier on that precision, right? Is it really important that we get close to the true value, or is it not so important? The second one is information cost. So this is like, how costly is it to build a more complex detector? Like, how hard is it to really discern, for instance, the true value of that Colombian basket? So here the idea is that each additional bin or label is costly. So in the theory part of this paper, we make some assumptions. So we're going to assume that the earnings, so this is the stakes part, so our earnings are going to be proportional to the distance between the label that we assign to the object, so the assigned value, minus the true value squared, and then multiplied by the stakes. Again, that's the importance of the decision. The costs of the problem, we're going to assume Shannon entropy cost. So this is a common assumption in the rational inattention literature. So basically here the cost is proportional to the probability of observing any particular or assigning any particular label multiplied by the log of that probability, multiplied by this parameter lambda. And so that lambda, again, is a free parameter that scales the costliness of assigning more bins, of having more of these labels. Okay, so these are our assumptions. We're going to be trying to maximize this complete function. So this benefit minus this cost. And we're finally going to assume that these values are uniformly distributed over the range. Okay. And so, of course, if we have a non-uniform distribution like the ones Rafa was talking about, then we're going to arrive at a different solution. But for today, we're going to focus on uniform distribution. And so Irfan has worked through the math, and what he's shown is, first of all, that when you make these assumptions, the first thing is that these bins should be equal sized. So you should tile the space with equal sized bins. But more interestingly is that there's a precise result for the optimal number of bins, and that is the square root of alpha divided by 6 lambda. Okay, and you'll remember that alpha is the stakes. This is how important the decision is. So if the decision is more important, if the stakes are higher, you should assign more bins to the problem. But also, it's decreasing in the cost of the bins. So if it's more costly to assign more bins, then you're going to have fewer bins. That's the prediction. Okay, so there's a lot of math behind this proof. I'm not going to go into that today, but instead we want to go and try to actually test this in an experiment. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to show people numbers. They're not actually values, but just numbers from 0 to 1,000, and we're going to ask people to label those numbers. Okay, so what we're going to do is across different trials, we're going to vary the stakes, the alpha parameter, and the label cost lambda. So we're actually going to assign people this Shannon information cost to see if they indeed have a Shannon information cost, can they optimize this decision problem. So in each trial, again, we vary the stakes, we vary the label cost, and we tell the subjects we're going to produce a random number from 0 to 1,000. And all the subject has to do is decide how many labels they want for their detector, for their machine. Once they build their machine, their job is done. The detector will automatically read in the value and assign it to the correct label and then generate a payoff for the participant. Now, this is a hard problem. So what we do is we have some decision aids. So we allow the subjects to test different numbers of labels to see what the resulting contingent payoffs would be depending on the random number that's generated. And we actually have several unpaid training blocks where we keep the stakes held constant and then vary the label cost. And then we also hold the label cost constant and vary the stakes. And we let them go through this. We let them play with the machines. And then once they commit to a machine, they get a random number. They get some feedback. They learn what their payoff was. So they get lots of chances to learn how best to optimize this decision problem. And then what we have is we have 25 actual incentivized paid trials where they can still play with the machines to determine what what machine would be best for them in that particular set of parameters, but we don't provide any feedback during those 25 trials. Okay, and these are the parameters we use. So these are the different label costs here, and then these are the different stakes that we use here. And then what you're seeing in this matrix is the optimal number of labels for that particular combination of parameters. So the optimal number of labels can vary anywhere from 1 all the way up to 34. Okay, so we have good variability across these trials in terms of how many bins or how many labels subjects should be allocating to their machine. Here's the experimental interface. So this is an example where a subject is sort of trying out a machine with 3 labels. Right? So this is the resulting payoff function that they get for that machine with 3 labels. So if the random number appears at exactly one of these 3 numbers, they get the maximum payoff because their label is spot on to what the actual number is. And as the actual number deviates from the middle of the bin, their payoff goes down. Okay, and so they can see, okay, in this trial, this is what the distance cost is, this is what the button cost is, or the label cost is, and then they can move their mouse around to simulate different random numbers and then see their resulting payoffs down here. Okay, so here you can see like, oh, if the random number is right at the top, they get a payoff of 98. If the random number happens to be further away, then their payoff drops to, say, 95. Okay, and then if they don't like this particular payoff function, they can hit the space bar and they can try out another machine that has 10 bins or 20 bins. And then once they're happy with their machine, they click the mouse button, and then again, that trial is over, and then they see a new set of parameters. Okay, and then the analysis. So the analysis is pretty simple. We want to test that model I showed you before, that optimal number of bin allocation. So we can test this with a regression model, where we can basically test whether we take the logarithm of both sides of that equation I showed you before, and we can test whether the coefficient should be positive 0.5 times the log of that stakes parameter alpha, and then the parameter on the button cost should be minus 0.5 on the log of that the button cost, the information cost. Okay. So here are the results. So I'll show you the results in a second. So here's what we expect. So again, based on what I just showed you, we'd expect the coefficient on the stakes to be positive 0.5 and the coefficient on the button cost to be minus 0.5. So that's the expected parameter value from this experiment. What do we actually find? We find something quite far from that. So we see that the coefficient on cost is about minus 0.3, and the coefficient on the stakes is about 0.1. So they're far less sensitive to both the cost and the stakes than they should be. However, they are in the correct direction, so at least they are responsive to cost in the way that they should be. So they're assigning more bins if there's a lower cost, and they're assigning more bins if there's higher stakes. So the directions are correct, but the magnitudes are considerably far off. Now we can look at the individuals. We can see how these individuals are scattered around. So again, the good news is that most of these subjects fall within this box where the cost parameter is negative, the stakes parameter is positive, but there are some subjects out here at the boundaries who are way off. And again, there's not many subjects who are anywhere near what we sort of expected based on the optimal solution here. So these subjects are not doing a great job at maximizing this problem. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes? Okay, great. That's basically that's what I have to show you. We can look at some individual results by breaking it down by the different stake sizes. So this is as you recall, this is the lowest stake size of 175, and then here are the different button costs. The stars represent where they should be. That's the optimal solution, the optimal number of bins, and then the colored circles are where the data actually are. So what the number of bins that subjects actually used. And we can see that the number of bins that subjects actually use are much higher generally than what they should be for these low stakes situations. And also the slope is sort of flat, the slope going across costs is flatter than it should be. if we kind of zoom ahead a little bit to, let's say, the highest stakes of 7,000, now we see sort of the opposite. So now, even though they should be using, in this case, like 35 bins, on average they're only using about 10 bins. So they're using far fewer bins than they should be when the stakes are high. And again, the slope is flatter than it should be as well. They're not nearly as responsive to the button cost as they should be according to the theory. Okay, so just to conclude, what we've shown is that given a Shannon information cost and a uniform distribution, the optimal number of bins that people assign to the problem should be increasing with the stakes and decreasing with the cost of precision or the cost of expertise in a very specific way. But unfortunately, in the data, what we find is that the directional effects are correct. People are responding in roughly the way that they should be, but the precise way that they're doing so, the optimization is way off. And in particular, we're finding that the subjects are way more sensitive to the button cost, to the label cost, than to the stakes, than to the importance of being close to the correct answer. And so as I said, this project is still work in progress. We're still designing future experiments where we will not assign people to have the Shannon information cost, but try to estimate the natural information cost that they have when they're making these kinds of valuation decisions. All right, so that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. So we open the space for questions.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes.
Well, you have 5 minutes.
It could be about any of the talks or cognitive economics in general, any of the common themes you've seen in these talks.
I feel like I probably shouldn't be the first person asking a question, but I'll just get things started maybe. So I think like one underlying theme obviously is that, taking into account the fact that, decision-making implies information processing in the brain, which is constrained by, the biology of the brain, is important, or maybe helps us improve how we can predict behavior and understand decision making better. I suppose one question would be, what are like the most direct implications that you think having these considerations will have on, say, the types of experiments that are more like the general, interest of this meeting, right? So things that have implications about welfare, or things that have, that are experiments that we do that are done in the field, or things like that. How can you reconcile, I guess, these two different traditions of research? Easy question.
I'll go first because I have one good example, I think. So I kind of briefly mentioned it during my talk, but there's a recent paper by Ryan Oprea which takes what is ostensibly looks like a risky decision-making task, except he removes the risk. So he essentially presents people multiple price lists of what he calls mirror lotteries, so mirrors. So he essentially disaggregates an expected value computation into a number of boxes, and your boxes have some numbers in them which are rewards, and I'm going to pay you, but you can open up all the boxes and then I'll just pay you the sum of that divided by 100, as opposed to I'm going to open one box and pay you the result of the box, which would be risky choice. And he finds the exact same pattern that you would expect in a risky choice, the fourfold pattern of risk aversion and loss aversion in this task. He's done this with multiple price lists, with binary choices, with willingness to pay. And what that suggests is that the tasks that we've been running, the lottery tasks that we've been running in experimental economics for the past 30 or 40 years might not be measuring risk preferences, they might be measuring something else. And for me, that was eye-opening because it meant that what we had thought we had been measuring was not what we were measuring. And that forces a reevaluation of everything that we have been doing in experimental economics for the past little while. So that's just one example, I think, but for me it was a striking one.
Yeah, so maybe let me complement what Ryan was saying. And I mean, Ian before brought up the book from Daniel Kahneman, right? So that was basically a compilation of a set of heuristics and descriptive models of, behavior related to biases in behavior, right? And then, let's say up to maybe 15 years ago, maybe people was happy with those descriptive equations, right? That were fitting the behavior, right? And then you would say, well, you are more risk averse, you will have more concavity in your utility function, and that was it, right? So that people would accept, yes, there are some heuristics, there are some biases, and let's say people was happy with this curve fitting and interpretation of those parameters of those curves. So now what, let's say this new era of cognitive economics is bringing is actually an explanation for those descriptive equations that, for instance, are very much in this book from Kahneman, right? So now is what Ryan was saying. So maybe it's not just a preference that you want to be more risky or more risk averse, but it's simply maybe very much grounded in your biology, right? So we have recent evidence, for instance, that the degree of riskiness actually relates to how much noise you have in the processing of numbers in your brain, right? And if you have that, so there is maybe no way to get around that as an individual, right? So you have to accept that you have that degree of noisiness in processing information, and that's what determines your behavior. But it's not a preference to be risky, it's just that your biology basically makes you look like having such a preference. Yeah.
I'll fall back on the DDM, and I'll say that one important aspect that I think has been we often ignore in experimental economics is the timing and how much time we give our participants, our subjects, to make their decisions. And time pressure. What we know from the drift diffusion model is that because there's noise in the way in which people process these options, the less time you give people, the more they have to rely on their priors. And so if you give people different amounts of time pressure, they're going to rely more or less on their priors, and so their valuations are going to change, their choices are going to change. In this example I showed you, their precision is going to change. And so I think when we're judging, when we're looking at behavior and we're comparing conditions, we have to be thinking about how much of what we're measuring is like true preference and how much of it is reliance on again, priors, past experience, context of the environment. And again, those things are going to change, and they can change in very predictable ways if we understand this kind of decision process.
Well, if we don't have more questions, yeah.
So for Ian's last talk, I actually have a very technical question, which is I don't understand why the cognitive cost is modeled as Shannon's entropy. What is the PA in it is induced value method, right? The way you implement the experiment.
We're inducing the function there. Again, okay. we use the Shannon entropy because it's a common assumption in the rational inattention literature. Essentially, the idea is that the Shannon information models essentially the number of yes/no questions that you would need to use to assign the proper bin. And so, like, the more bins you have, the more questions you need to ask to arrive at to decide on a final bin. And so again, more bins is more costly, and also more evenly distributed bins is also more costly. And so that function is just, basically essentially measures the surprise of a particular observation.
Yeah. So on the result, the fact that subjects are more sensitive to the cause, isn't that consistent with loss aversion? Let's say 0 is the reference point. They're more sensitive to what they may lose from the cost of having more labels.
Well, in the experiment, they're both framed as costs. So you're given an endowment, and then the farther your label is from the true value, you lose some money from that, and then you also lose some money from paying for extra labels. So they're both framed as costs in the experiment.
Okay.
So.
I have some questions about, we were facing in experimental economics the problem with having student samples, no? And you have also special samples. And I know that the brain is determined by how it grows and is nurtured when you are children. So that how would affect all these measurements, all these results, when we're dealing with brains that are very different because of the environment?
Well, so yeah, that's very interesting. So for instance, there is this literature on numerical cognition, right? So for instance, it has been shown that when, let's say when you are in the educated world, let's say, you have way less biases in your numerical cognition than, for instance, if you go to tribes in the Amazonas, for instance, and you ask them to estimate numbers based on objects that they observe, their biases are way, way larger, right? So basically, it means that literacy and education kind of diminishes those biases by a large extent relative to no education. And no education does not simply mean saying, well, why you cannot estimate better a number in the Amazonas versus here, if there is also maybe useful, right, to count the number of fruits that maybe you have to gather, or how many, whatever, birds are there, or and so on. But it's simply the fact that dealing more often with numbers, like what we do in our education, right? That since kids enter school, right? They enter, they have to deal with numbers, they have to operate with numbers. Many of the subjects are related to that. And it has been shown actually, again, that individuals who are not used to deal with numbers since they are kids have way, way more biases than individuals that do. And my strong prediction, for instance, would be here that for the type of tasks that we like to use in our behavioral economics, if you were to apply them to the Amazonas tribes, you will see that they will reflect, for instance, more risk aversion relative to individuals who, go to the usual schools. So this is a very strong prediction that I have, but still, right? So it reflects how much your environment and your education can shape the supposedly preferences that we observe. Yeah.
And there's actually some older work in psychology linking ability to place a number on a number line and risk aversion. Again, consistent with some of what Rafa was talking about, that just basic numerical cognition, just our ability to place a number on a line can influence something like a risk aversion.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly. I think one area that's, I think, somewhat unexplored in economics, but is really interesting, is the idea of how neurodiversity maps into preferences and maps into the results we see in our experiments, right? So typically we run an experiment, like how many of your subjects do you think have ADHD in your experiments? Probably like 15 or 20% of them. And that means they have these different patterns of how they apply attention, and likely what you're measuring are these different preferences in that subpopulation. And so thinking about how we would, not moving outside of the lab into the real world, and how we would try to classify people into these potential buckets and try to address heterogeneity is not just noise in the sense of there's some distribution of people in the world, but we could actually classify them into different thinking patterns is I think an interesting area to go to look at.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, just a quick clarification on that. I think Sandra's question was also about the kind of stage of brain development and the fact that adolescent brains are still in a period period of, especially male brains. And so the extent to which the samples are taking from a certain age range, and how much we can generalize then on adult brains, fully adult brains.
Yes, I mean, so in relating to choice consistency and preferences, there are examples of not only, I mean, one thing we know from behavior is that adults become, teens are more, less ambiguity averse than adults are. So they tend to have preferences for ambiguity, but then as adults get older, and then they start to become less consistent in their choices and become more noisy. And that has actually been correlated with the amount of white matter that people have, because of course white matter degrades as you go through time. And so there's actually these relationships between the amount of essentially processing capability that your brain has and measures of inconsistency, and as an explanation for why people's behavior changes when they get older.
Okay, so thank you very much to our panelists. We ran out of time. Thank you very much. And just one announcement and one reminder. The reminder is we have the conference dinner tonight at 7 in the Museo Nacional. And we will have, the announcement is we have some shuttles departing at 6:30 in front of this building next to the flags. So thank you very much, everyone.